It is Jason Fields and Latasha Fields, and we want to thank you all for joining us as we talk about, Black professionals in what we call far too often white spaces. And just so you all know, we are recording this, but as we get into it, if you got questions or comments, in order to keep this flowing and keep it efficient, please put yourself on Zoom. I think Tasha is controlling a lot of this, and hopefully we will have a great, a discussion, a dialogue. But as we get into this, let me tell you all about how this came about, and then Tasha and I will get into it. Again, if you got questions, shoot them in there. If you agree, if you disagree, what have you. This topic or this, go ahead. You got something back?
No. Yeah, I was going to say, drop it in the chat. You said the Zoom. I was just letting them know where to put the questions. They can put them in the chat. And then also, if you could keep your microphone muted, unless, until we get to a point where we're accepting questions, we would appreciate that.
Anything else, wife?
No, go ahead. You got this
Clear.
thing.
Clear. So part of this came about because Tasha and I, with the pandemic, we've both been doing a lot of work from home. Many of you who know, the both of us know that I pretty much do a lot of business, a lot of work in business, finance. Tasha does a lot in equity and education. And one of the things that I think we saw as a similarity in some of the things that we would discuss, after the day was closed, and some of the things that we were going through. And one of them, was how do we show up in these spaces? And to start this off, before we got here, Tasha and I were joking, and I said, are you ready? You're the president of something. And Tasha said, I'm not showing up as that. I'm showing up as a Black woman today. And as I started thinking about that, and for those of you in business and I'm in politics, I don't know if I have the luxury of showing up as a Black man versus State Representative Jason Fields or entrepreneur guru Jason Fields. And so I wanted us to talk about that a little bit. Do we have that option, particularly in often far white spaces, to show up as anything other than that profession? So what did you, when you said that, Tasha, talk to me, what did that mean?
So for me, I was just telling you that I'm really pushing myself not to have to code switch, because it's so exhausting, like from how I show up in the way that I dress, the way that I speak and all of that, because it's a lot. And when I told you I was showing up as a Black woman, I just meant I'm showing up as I am and not really wondering about who's at the table, who's, listening. And that has not always been, because I think that a lot of times, I've been conditioned to understand what professional means, what the standards of how you should carry yourself means. One, in my household with my Black mother, but also in the professional world, where typically white is the standard. And I'm just at a place in my life where I'm like, no, that's not going to be the standard for me anymore. And so so that's what I meant by saying that I'm going to show up just as who I am, because I can't be anything else. Although I do understand, like you said, you feel like there's this, professional Jason Fields and there's this other Jason Fields. And so when we talk about how are we showing up, I think it's important to think about who's at the table and what's your message. What are you trying to do? And because we're talking about being Black in predominantly white spaces and how we navigate that, I think it's important for us to be authentic in how we show up, especially in spaces where change is needed in terms of injustices that might be occurring.
So one of the things I think that I struggled with was, in these professional spaces, it's tiring, and what do I mean by that is, as a Black businessman, as a Black elected official, often, whether I like it or not, I represent all Black people, whether it's fair or not, or I can't get upset or angry about stuff because the label, well, you shouldn't be the angry black man. But it's sort of stifling, because when I look at what's happening in America, and I look at what's happening in this country, in this world today, where black men are being shot, where there is a double standard here, particularly in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. And you and I talked about that. And to give you all a case, an example, and I don't want this to come across like I'm a sore loser or anything, but let's talk about the comptroller's race. Mm-hmm. When I ran, lost by 900 votes, fine. You and I are both like, hey, listen, God knows what he's doing. There's a reason for all of that stuff. And then months later, I see a headline saying the comptroller's office lost $8.6 million. And I immediately got upset, because in my mind, if that would have been me, we would have been reading that headline. We would have been reading that story every single freaking day for 2 weeks.
And there would have been a recall.
Right.
$8 million.
And so to go through that as a black professional man and go, wait a second, you all are treating people a lot differently here. And then if I get upset about it, I can't be upset about it, because if I get upset about it, somehow I'm the angry black man. Well, hell, don't I got a right to be upset? Don't I have a right to be upset when I look at all the stuff that's happening, particularly to black men? And we live in a world where whenever we put something, we got to justify being black. We somehow got to defend our blackness. You know, who said this was the way to be? Who said I couldn't be angry about this stuff when anger is what's warranted?
Mm-hmm. You know, that reminds me, like in education, lately we've been talking a lot about a term called spirit murdering, which was really coined by a black scholar, a legal scholar, Patricia Williams. And basically it talks about how racism is really traumatic. And it's more than just physical pain. It really threatens our dignity and our humanity. And I think that oftentimes we're put in places where we can't be human. You know, if you're angry, I mean, you know, you got the angry black woman stereotype. If you're, you know, upset or questioning something, you're aggressive. And so, you know, we talk about that often in the context of children in education, and how a lot of times teachers murder the spirits of students. But lately I've been thinking about, well, those children grow up to be adults. And so if your dignity, your humanity has been challenged, by the time that you're a 40-plus-year-old adult, if you haven't dealt with that, you are going to show up in ways that are not considered appropriate, and you are going to be angry and upset and hurt in ways that show out differently than they would had you dealt with that. And I think for me, I know you talk a lot about solutions, and I know we'll get to that, but for me, I've had to actively continue to seek out spaces where I know that I could be really validated and affirmed by people who care about me, who truly care about me.
Let's, you know, because I know we'll get to the solutions part, but some of the things that I wanted to ask, and I've learned a lot from you. You talked about the phrase white fragility. Like, I didn't really start hearing that stuff until being married to you and dealing with, first off, what is it? What does it mean? And why is it sort of received negatively?
Yeah, so white fragility is a term that Robin DiAngelo uses and explains the discomfort and defensiveness that white people get when you talk about issues of race, issues of social justice. And one of the things that I recently heard, Dr. Bettina Love, who's also a scholar, she was like, white people don't get to be fragile. She said, I don't believe in white fragility. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but when she said that, I took pause, because I'm like, yeah, wait a minute. So when white people are defensive and or crying or upset, you know, they're fragile. When we're crying, upset, or defensive, we're angry, we're aggressive. And so I think it's really important. I know we can predict with a lot of people you know, when you have conversations, I can think of many conversations I've had with white colleagues where either tears were shed or just defensive, you know, this defensiveness. So we couldn't have an authentic conversation because it was shut down by their emotions. And I think that it's important for us to recognize where we are, but if we're going to have conversations about race and injustice, which we have to have if we're going to change anything, especially today, then we can't be stopped by, you know, worrying about how people are going to react. And so I think that that term white fragility, I have a whole different perspective, and that was just the other day. I've been thinking about that a lot. You know, how we coin terms is really important because on one hand, that term fragile just, you know, it's kind of like a sensitive term, you know, and it alludes to like you have to coddle, although I know that that's not what Robin DiAngelo means by that. However, I do understand what Dr. Love was saying is that, you know, hey, we don't have time for that. We got to get moving and we have to get things done and we have to stand up for what's right. And if that means talking about race explicitly, if that means talking about social justice, let's do what we have to do because we don't really have time for people, you know, to be fragile, so to speak. And I think when I think of that term, just in my current work, I do grapple with that. Like, how do I have these authentic conversations and stay engaged and keep others engaged, but also not really worry about the other person, if that makes sense, and not in a way where being disrespectful, but speaking my truth without worrying about how it's received, but just so that it is received.
Do you think, particularly, and I know this from experience as I examine myself, when I think of that phrase, and maybe it should be termed differently, I don't know, but there are a lot of times, whether it's in business or politics, that I didn't continue with a conversation because I was worried that, you know what, I'm not going to get anywhere because one, the fragileness or the reaction that I'm not racist. And when you start going to those places, you get to a point where you can't even talk about this kind of stuff. And then as African American professionals, on top of that, you got to deal with, well, how are you showing up? Are you really in a space where you're going to get something done? Or are we just all doing this stuff to get along and we're not really solving the issue? Because in politics, there are times where, and I think this will go into our next topic, the next discussion, this nice racist. And when I didn't know, or I don't want to say I didn't know, but you know, this whole idea of racism, because no one wants to be called that. No one wants to be like a racist. And I get that, right? But even me, even when we say racist, it's the Ku Klux Klan member, it's the angry person, it's the tiki torch people. But we also are inundated with what you call a nice racist. And I've heard this not just from Black people, but from other white folks or white colleagues as well, who will point out that, yeah, you can be nice and still a racist. When what does that mean?
Yeah, I think, well, you know, a lot of people, a lot of my white colleagues who I have had conversations with would say that white people get defensive and say that they're not a racist because, yeah, they do think about the Ku Klux Klan or now what the Proud Boys. They think about those people who are just out there in the open. And honestly, to me, they're not as dangerous as the nice white people, racist people, because our institutions,
So where they
our educational institutions, our government officials are loaded with nice white racist people. And what I mean is these are people who are upholding those systems, holding up systemic racism. So they're nice. They're not going to say, oh, we don't like Black people or people of color. But the policies and practices and systems that they create and continue to support and perpetuate oppose those racist ideas and ideologies. So unless you're examining, and you don't even have to be white to do that. One of the things that's bothered me a lot lately, I'm constantly examining myself because I think as a Black woman, I've been conditioned to whiteness as a default. And I think that one thing that bothers me is when I'm talking to a Black person or a person of color who doesn't get it in terms of why something is deemed as racist, or how they're holding up policies and practices that are racist. And I think that that can be dangerous also because, I mean, people make assumptions. I feel like I've had to dig into this equity work and race work for survival, because I had to understand like why I'm being treated a certain way, or why I'm feeling a certain way, or why in Wisconsin, Black children are, or Black people, period, are at the bottom of every metric in terms of education, health, economics, you name it. And I had to understand like, why is that? And not to say that racism is the only issue, but it does play a role. And so for me, understanding like where people are leads me to understand like what we could potentially do to do something different, because what we're doing is not working. I was recently in a meeting where we were looking at our state data and the gaps in terms of reading and math. That's usually what it plays out for education, was measured. Black children not doing well, not, there's a huge gap, and in Black and brown children, period. And the that's very bothersome for me as an educator, because I know we have the answers. And I'm like, what is it that's stopping us from doing what we need to do? And how do we get beyond these practices and policies? Like when we really sit down and are honest with ourselves about what we're doing, I think we can make a change. But I feel like some people in power are thinking, you know, hey, it is what it is. They become kind of numb to the data, like, you know, and for me, I can't, and I struggle too with being a part of that problem because I'm an educator. So I've been in positions where I've also upheld these policies and practices that are not beneficial. And so I'm always looking at what are those things that I have power and control over, and how do I enter in and disrupt with, along with my colleagues, along with others, how do I disrupt that and bring it to the forefront so that we can work through that?
I want to get to something that Tiffany wrote because we talked about that, you and I. But I love the fact that you said, you know, some of this stuff, and we talked about this too, you don't necessarily have to be white to be a part of. And I think as a Black professional, everybody needs to take inventory of where they're at and what you're doing to perpetuate or uphold these same systems. Because there has to be an admittance that, you know, we've all been conditioned. Even I've been conditioned to the point where I talked about this, and then it'll be an intro into what Tiffany was saying. You know, you become you are expert in a certain field, but yet you start second guessing yourself because, you know, as Tiffany mentioned, you get a white counterpart that wants to not necessarily challenge, but you live in this space where it's like you always have to, you know, prove your thesis. You know what I mean? You always have to fight your case. Case in point, I'm giving a presentation, and I see John here, one of the money managers I deal with a lot, talking about why we should have more minority finance money managers in the state and how we should focus on entrepreneurs. And one of the responses was, well, we look for people who had experience, people who've done this, people who've done that. And myself and my dear friend Corey Nettles, who pointed out, well, that's part of the problem. You know, two things. One, you say that's what you're looking for, but yet that's not always the case, because we've seen you hire and mentor and bring on a bunch of unqualified white folks. But then when it comes to Black folks, then we get steered towards, well, you don't have the experience, you don't have that. And so we're going, you can't sit there and say, this is your prerequisite, this is your requirement, when you're not always meeting that. And on the second side, on the flip side of that, when you do point that out, when you do point these things out, that there's a discrepancy, that there's a void, somebody inevitably wants to point out the reason why there's a void. instead of just saying it's a void because of bias. It's a void because certain systems have been perpetuated. But if you say that, you almost got to back up your data. You know, in the financial industry, I put out something that said Black people have not been getting loans, or there's been an 80% decrease in getting loans. Immediately, some of my, and these are white friends, well, how many Black people applied?
Right.
You always got to justify something instead of it just being what it is. Instead of you just taking my word for it because I live this, because this is my experience, you want me to now prove to you that that's the case. And as Tiffany said, that gets tiring as a Black professional. It gets really tiring because you begin to fight and you get exhausted, you get tired, you get angry, but wait, I can't get angry because if I get angry, then that's a problem. And then if y'all hire some Black folks or bring on Black folks who the rest of the community ain't too thrilled about, then that's a problem because everybody who Black ain't necessarily for the community. So as a Black professional, you got so many things that's hitting you that it gets, as she said, it gets very exhausting. And so talk to me about, as we get into the solutions, what are some of the things what are some of the things that we can do? I mean, you take it from whatever angle you want.
Yeah, I just want to also say before I talk about that, yes, Tiffany's point about that second guessing yourself is you'll think you're crazy. I mean, I experienced that. I went to Marquette University for undergrad, and I was sometimes the only Black student in the classroom. That was back in the late 90s. And so I know what's sad is that it's still true today, but that's another talk. But what my point is that what I find often is the confidence of some white people is so high, even when they're wrong, they will have you thinking you're crazy. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not true. And so you do have to come with the facts and the data. Otherwise, they're not trying to hear you. But I've had many conversations with white colleagues, and it is exhausting. It's very exhausting. It's like you have to constantly pick and choose your battles in terms of what you're going to address, what you're not going to address when it comes to aggressions, or when it comes to people challenging you on your experiences or what you know as a Black person showing up, or just in general. I mean, I've been asked in certain places like, how did you get here? Like who, and I'm like, what do you mean, how did I get here? I was invited just like you were because I belong here. And so, yeah, those are just things. But a few things that I thought about, Jason, since we talked about this, are just a few solutions or things that have worked for me. And one of those is creating like racial affinity spaces. And what I mean by that, having a space where you can connect with other Black people, in this case, because I'm Black, where you could just relax and relate and release. And I know that's from a different world. But anyway, where you can connect and have someone who understands where you're coming from. And what I found that in a lot of my jobs, that was something natural. I would just automatically attract to those people. We would have our little, meetings or side conversations or just connect in a way because we needed to build each other up in those spaces. And one thing that's happening at my current position, there are opportunities to create these formal spaces. So we talk with our supervisors and say, hey, we need a formal space during work time where we can connect with people, with Black people can connect with Black people, white people connecting with white people. But in this particular case, encouraging those white colleagues to talk about white supremacy culture. How can you dismantle this? And with my Black colleagues, how are we healing? How do we need to respond to people when they say X, Y, Z? And so because we have different needs in the workplace. And I think that when it comes to handling that could be a way to do it. It's just to intentionally create those spaces where you can connect with people who have similar experiences and say, hey, let's check in every couple of weeks. Or if you have an issue with a colleague, let's talk about how you can respond to certain things before you lose your job or whatever the case may be. So that's one thing that I thought about. Jason, you look like you were going to say something.
Yeah, because you mentioned that and we talked about that, and you know, there was a thing where I think for me and you that makes sense, and I'm wondering, you know, and we've talked about this whether it's in education and business, is it fair, unfair to say, hey, to our white colleagues, friends, you all should get together and talk about this stuff alone?
No, well, I'm not saying that we necessarily have to tell them that that's for my specific work situation, but I'm saying that there are for if white people want to make a difference and want to create better work environments for people of color, then they have to find some like-minded white people to talk about, hey, you know, what policies and practices do we have in place that's disengaging our Black colleagues or our colleagues of color, and what are we doing about that? And so I'm not saying that you say, you know, go to work tomorrow like, hey, white people go talk to white people. I'm just saying as a way to survive and thrive for Black people, it's good to make those connections, and as a way to make a difference, because a lot of times in organizations where whiteness is the standard, even if the supervisors are Black, it's important to have those spaces. That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying I don't know if any white people are on the call, but if they wanted to, because I have some friends and colleagues who are like, you know what, we know things are not right, let's talk. So there is a space for interracial dialogue as well. I'm not saying that you just have to talk to people who look like you, so to speak, but also having those spaces where you can talk together about those, what those solutions could be in the workplace.
One of the things that you said, and I think I understand it, the white standard, and it's, what is that? I mean, because I think I understand it. What I'm finding that is that even my own conditioning, that I have to question that, you know, and you've helped me get to this point where why is my outlook that? Who said that was right? Who said, I mean, why is that the standard? What is that?
So I'm gonna use a non-work example, just basic things that are starting to change now. But if you look at these babies who are taking like ballet classes, for example, in nude stockings. So you have baby girls with chocolate dark skin in these white nude stockings, because nude for me is not the same nude as it is for a white person. And so because that's the standard, though, that color, or even when you think about band-aids, or even as a woman, if I'm going to buy some pantyhose and it says nude, I know that's not for me. Now, some of my sisters are, you know, that shade where they can buy nude stockings and they're good. But if that, you know, some places where that's set, like, okay, you need to go get this color, you know, and if it's not right, or you need to wear your hair in a certain way. And we know that Black people and white people, our hair is different. And so I think that those are examples, non-work examples. But when we talk about work, you know, just the concepts of what professional is. And we know that we are getting to a better place, but I still see stories where I probably couldn't work in certain places because I have sister locks. Or, you know, if you don't have, for you, Black men, you know, shaving your facial hair or whatever. So I'm just saying that there are some spaces where what's considered professional, a standard of whiteness is the standard, not just, you know, hey, this is what's professional as long as you're clean and neat in appearance. But there, sometimes it gets so specific as to how you should show up with your hair, your language. And I'm not saying that having standards is a bad thing, but who sets the standards, and then what is the impact of that, you know? And so if we think about, yes, you need to show up to work clean. I mean, we don't have to tell people that. Yes, you need to show up to work dressed appropriately, but what's appropriate, you know? And so all of those things that we think about in terms of what those rules and regulations are, we have to reflect on that and say, you know, is this really something that is necessary? Like the baby boy who had his locks shaved off because the rule was that you couldn't have long hair or whatever for wrestling. Like, are these necessary rules? In education, I feel like it's a lot more flexibility. Like no one told me how to wear my hair or, anything like that. But in the classroom, or of course, I guess with some sports, there are some standards set for children. So those are things I think we have to think about. Like, and that's where those policies and practices, like examining those policies and practices is important, because we have to figure out where are we missing the mark, and who are we excluding, and who are we discriminating against because of these policies and practices.
I want to, Tony, Anthony, we put something, made a comment, and we talked a little bit about that. And this goes into for me, like I agree with what he said.
Sounds just like you.
Because we went to the same school. And we played ball together. So
you want to read his comment?
Yeah. So someone said, in a competition, you tend to have strong interest in learning your opponent's weakness. Once you have a solid understanding of those weaknesses, you attack those weaknesses to gain an advantage while operating in white spaces. We must constantly and consistently educate ourselves as to how they think so that we are able to counter several of their next moves. And I agree with that. I think we do. And I think that's part of why is that onus always on us?
Yes.
Like I get tired of trying to but I'm tired of trying to figure out what the hell other people doing. Why we can't just come in here and everybody do what we know we're supposed to do? But it goes into it's time. Like I gotta wear a certain suit. I can't wear dreads. We always have to be the ones to go out of our way to make everybody else comfortable. And that gets so tiring that you don't even have time to just be you. And to make it personal, as a young state legislator, it got to a point where I forgot who Jason Fields was. I just became State Representative Jason Fields. I didn't know who Jason Fields was. I had lost sight. I just was conditioned and the standard was set. And I knew, just like Tony, every time I was entering that building, entering an arena, entering a room, that was my responsibility. And as a Black man, you get tired of that. As I'm sure as Black women, you get tired of always having the onus put on you to adapt.
Yeah, I agree. And I know I had a white colleague say something similar to, Latasha, I want to know what you know, and can you give me this or tell me about this when it comes to race and equity? And I'm like, let's call her Susie. I'm like, Susie, you got to do the work. You need to read. You need to build some authentic relationships with other people. You need to make connections. You got to figure this out, because I'm figuring this out, for one, not by choice, but two, also by choice, because one, I'm a Black woman. I feel like I have to figure stuff out for survival, but also wanting to understand how to get things done. I have to figure it out. So I'm like, you got to figure this out. How do you use your white privilege? Talk to the white people who got it, help, seek some help and understanding. And it is a burden, because when you are always trying to stay a step ahead or always trying to figure things out, it's a lot. But I agree with Anthony, it's necessary, sometimes, because you have to survive. And again, Dr. Love, one of my favorite scholars, we don't want to just survive, we want to thrive. And so you don't have the energy by the time you're done navigating all these spaces, trying to figure all these things out. Sometimes you just don't have the energy, especially now during a pandemic where there's a whole nother layer of madness that's playing out.
There's Tiffany just mentioned professional trust. And I think in the industries you're in, the industries that I'm in, that's a lot of it. Where as a Black person, a Black professional, there is a huge lack of trust that we actually know what we're doing. In the investment world, 1% of venture capital, private equity dollars go to Black money managers. Even when the statistics and the data say we perform better than non-diverse firms. So then the logical question becomes, well, why aren't we giving money, or why aren't we getting money? Because it's a bias, or it's a lack of trust that Black folks know what they're doing, that Black professionals know what they're doing. And so on one hand, unless you are one of those Black professionals who they deem worthy and necessary, you constantly fighting an uphill battle, particularly in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, where, you know, if you're not chosen, you look for different fertile ground. You look for fertile ground elsewhere. And I think that's a detriment to the community and to the state, because it gets exhausting. When the pandemic and all of the racial unjust came out, I said one of these things. I made a post saying, you know, if you're going to really effectuate change, then you need to trust Black folks and put them in power to help make that change. Don't say, hey, we want to make change, and then you have, you know, all white folks heading up the diversity office.
Right.
Or, you know, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but what I am saying is that if you really want to make change and you're serious about it, you need to put some Black professionals in a position to help you change that. I don't know if we got that. I don't know if we're there yet.
Yeah, that professional trust that's huge and very important. But I often think about something that you say, Jay, a lot of times, and this is just not about race, but because we're talking about race right now, just waiting for white folks to catch up. So for example, prior to the pandemic, you know, there were a lot of issues, and still are a lot of issues of social injustice in education, a lot of issues of just social injustice, period. And now we have a lot of companies, you know, on board, a lot of people on board. And I even had a few white people who I'm connected with, they send me all this stuff about racism and Blackness. And I'm like, I've been on that. It's like, I'm glad you're here today, you know, and you're on board now. But Black people have been talking about this for years, decades. And so it's like, you know, a lot of times we have to wait for others to empower, white people in power, to say, oh, maybe we aren't treating Black people fairly. Let's do something about that. While you've been saying, hey, y'all ain't been treating us right, you know, let's do something about this. And so I think this pandemic, one good thing that's come out of this is that a lot of organizations are turning their attention to looking at their policies and practices and saying, taking pause and figuring this out. And so I appreciate it, but I know it can be frustrating because you're waiting for things to change and you're working for things to change. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, now they're with me. So let's keep this momentum and let's make some changes. And so I just think that that's important, and that's something that I wanted to just bring up.
No, I mean, I think when we talked about that, and for everybody listening, we were talking about the spaces and how tiring it is. And you and I both know we have friends and people we love, and it's this awakening. But I think sometimes folks don't know how tiring that is. And I talk about it a lot because you know how I feel, like how far ahead I am on stuff, particularly here in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. It's exhausting. I mean, if we've been saying something for years, in the case of the entrepreneurship space, there's a problem with a lack of capital going to Black entrepreneurs. I've been saying this for years. John has been saying it. Anybody in business has been saying it. And now all of a sudden, because certain people have got to a point where the data shows it literally is a problem, now we want to do something. And it's tiring because, again, it goes to what Tiffany was saying, professional trust. You don't think we smart enough or know enough to know what we've been talking about for years? And now with this newfound enthusiasm, right? You joked about it that we got white folks telling us some Black facts that we didn't even know about,
Right.
like I done learned so much Black history from white people that I'm like, wow, I didn't even know that. So they inundate you with all this stuff, And on one hand, it's cool, I get it. But on the other hand, and this is where they need to know, it's exhausting sometimes because it's like, yeah, we glad y'all finally caught up. I mean, but we could have been further along.
Right.
Did you have some stuff you wanted to touch on as we have 15 minutes?
Because we only have 15 minutes, I guess I would like to know, well, one other thing I want to talk about, if there are any white people on the call, is just this difference between the allyship and being a co-conspirator. And allies are great because they're, they're there, they've read the books, they understand, the issues. But a co-conspirator, I think, is a different level of allyship because it really is about, how are you building those authentic relationships with people of color? How are you really connecting to the community and understanding? And what are you willing to put on the line? And I know, a lot of times we don't talk about that, but I think that it's important. We need white people. I mean, you think about abolitionists, who were willing to go out of their way. And I know I keep talking about Dr. Love because I love her work. And she talks about being an abolitionist educator. How do we make sure that we're doing those things to actually free and liberate, ourselves and liberate others? What powers do you have? What privilege do you have? And I know we're talking about race tonight, but all of us have privilege in some area, whether it's our gender, our race, our religious beliefs, something in your experience is privileged. And so how are you working and connecting with others about, about who they are and what their experiences are in order to make a difference?
What's the real difference between an ally and a co-conspirator?
Baby, you weren't listening. I just said.
No, because
I said that. So, okay. So for example, you're promoting a common interest. And I think one of the things is, again, language matters. So a lot of people use the term ally, and, a lot of white people say, oh, I'm an ally of, I'm an ally of Black people, whatever, for the cause. But there's no action. And so I think the biggest difference is action. So
okay.
if I'm an ally.
That makes sense to me because in my world, I got a bunch of allies. But what you telling me is, hell, I need some co-conspirators. I need some people that need to, hey, if we're talking about putting Black folks in power to change the narrative, then you need to be championing that along with me and talking to your folks.
Yes, where's that action piece? And I think a lot of people say that because it feels good. I'm an ally. They believe the stuff, they read the stuff, but when it comes to that action piece, I believe that a co-conspirator is willing to act and willing to put something on the line.
Okay. White privilege, I know we talked about it. It is something where that brings a lot of debate. You said we've all have privileges, but I don't know if people are really clear on it. Particularly for our white counterparts who will be watching this, because this is not just you and I decided to talk about white folks. This ain't that. But I do believe that given the arenas we're in and the things that we've seen, there are some things that do need to be cleared up. And some people think white privilege is, well, I grew up poor, I grew up in the hood too, so I don't have no white privilege.
Mm-hmm. But I think what people have to understand, so what I've come to learn is that white people typically don't talk about race at home. We talk about race all the time in my family and in Black families that I know of. And so when you talk about white privilege and people think of it as, oh, I'm racist, I did something wrong, they shut down, white people shut down. And I think it's really not about that. It's about looking at how has whiteness been set as the standard, and people, because of just your skin color, which is so crazy to me, I'm just baffled by it. Just because of your skin color, you are afforded certain privileges. I mean, we could talk about things from housing to economics to education, even if you look at, especially in Milwaukee, because we're so racially segregated, and even within similar institutions, if they're on different parts of the city, they have more resources, or they may have access to things in a different way. And so I think that it's important to recognize, yeah, that's a thing. That's the thing, being white. And one other thing, so when I talked about different privileges, for just to give an example, when we think about religion in America, Christianity is privileged, right? Our calendars revolve around Christianity, our food, our holiday, everything kind of revolves around that as a religion. So if you're not a Christian person, then you're like, I don't celebrate Christmas. I don't need this time off. I need to make my money. Or if you're of faith where certain foods you don't eat, it's like, or certain times of the, year or the day you don't eat certain things. It's, we have to think about what's really privileged in this country. And then if you are a male, there are certain privileges. If you are able-bodied, there are certain privileges that you have. I know my mother and I think we were in New York or somewhere. Oh, I think, yeah, we were in New York. This was a long time ago, but we were in New York with some family, and one of the people with us was in a wheelchair. We could not get that wheelchair. We hardly had access to any other places that we were going to because they didn't have ramps. And I'm like, what kind of, place is that? So I think that when you think about privilege in general, we all have some level of privilege depending on who you are. But when we're talking about white privilege, which is really prevalent, is where that power is, we have to really think about what does that mean and what do we do about that? Because that's really running our systems, that's really running how we're making decisions about things in terms of education, in terms of politics and things, just so that that privilege can be maintained.
Okay. So man, as we got 9 minutes, did you want to open it up for a few people, or?
Yeah, if you have, we can open it up for questions. If there is anyone who has a question, you can drop it in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question or make a comment if there's something that you wanted to bring up. So we'll wait a couple of minutes for that.
What's up, Tone? I see you just made a statement, Tone. So give me something on that.
I did. How you doing, Jason, man? Good to see you, brother.
Good to see you, bro.
So, this myth of the melting pot comes to mind when we talk about white privilege. And the reason it comes to mind is because, when people think of melting pot, they think of, authentic cultures being able to come together and be one, or be your authentic self, so to speak. Sorry about that. When really the melting pot concept was really to bring in all these different cultures, and then you were to then change or forget where you came from and basically assimilate or adjust to what Euro white America was about.
Right.
And so you guys talked about this, or you hit on it a little bit earlier when you talked about the standard. And so when we talk about education and all those different avenues, that's the standard that has been drilled in our minds, is that this is the way it's supposed to be. So again, it's still happening today where you may have someone come over from, I'm just going to throw out a country, Italy. And when they move here, they're expected to completely, dismantle what they've learned or what they've thought, their ideologies over in their native country. And then they come here to the melting pot, so to speak. And now they're asked or required, even from little small things like not providing additional translations. You know what I mean? So again, you're forced to learn English versus if you know that one particular community is majority Hispanic or has some Hispanic, residents, then why are we not trying to accommodate in those spaces for these folks that have bought into the melting pot concept?
That's good, man. I mean, I think that's a whole nother episode, brother, because I think you can really talk about that. So, John, did you have something, man?
Yeah. This was really good, and just staying on the topic of, I guess, Wisconsin and Black professionals, because it's so interesting. Because when you fly into Mitchell Airport, you just think of this all white folks, because you don't see anything else. And so from Mitchell Airport, and I usually stay at the Pfister, and I usually eat and tinker around that area, I never see Black folks. You know, you don't see professionals. Maybe maybe when I get over to City Hall, I may see a few. But that's the whole concept, I think, that Wisconsin has missed. And I think you're right on point with this. And when it brought it home one time when I was doing a presentation in Detroit, but I was doing it with a very ultra conservative white firm in Milwaukee. And to get that they absolutely know what they're saying is that he said, or he suggested that he wear his gold chain around his wrist because we were going to Detroit. And I thought about it and I thought about it. And I'm like, wow, they really watch how we dress. And so I can see the different channels on how we have to act and how we have to dress and be so non-threatening. Everything he said, I'm like, wow, he gets it. And he was reversing it because we were going to Detroit. Mm-hmm. So I think what you're addressing is just so on point. And that's just my little comment there.
Thank you, man. I'm glad you and Tony, baby, you had something before we close out?
No, I was just going to say thank you about the last couple of comments. That's it. Appreciate those comments.
No, I think and I'm glad, Tasha, if you can close out, because you know how I think you and I both, I hate not going out on solutions. And one of the things I was thinking about is something that you said. Like, I believe that there should be, as African-American professionals throughout this country, and even here where you have all these things that we have to deal with, I don't know how you can continue to get through all this if you don't have a group of people where you can go and talk about this stuff. I mean, thank God you and I have each other to talk about this stuff, but as a solution, we do need to necessarily be there. And I love the idea of what you've experienced in your work is, letting our co-conspirators, allies know there's some work on your behalf too. Don't put this all on us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's one way to handle this, is to create spaces like this, what we're doing now, talking to each other. And then also creating those interracial spaces where you can have those courageous conversations. I know I had the opportunity to co-facilitate a book study with one of my white friends and a couple of colleagues, and actually a couple of my sorors. And that was really eye-opening for me, because one thing is, I feel like I'm often in spaces where I have to recognize and acknowledge white folks are on their journey. And so they may say stuff or do stuff that's irritating or, crazy, but I'm on my journey too. And so I have to make sure to make space for that. And I say that to say, I learned a lot in those interracial conversations and really listening to perspectives, even those things, that were hard to hear. Because I thought, oh my gosh, that was so racist. But working through that and having those conversations really helped me to understand and broaden my perspective about some things. And so I think talking, of course we want action eventually, but talking, it's so just basic conversations sometimes we can't even have because people are turned off when they hear the word equity or social justice. And I get it. We've been using this, these terms so much that they've been watered down and not really meant they don't really mean a lot right now, but it's still relevant, it's still important. And so we have to decide, where are we going to create those spaces where we can, Black people can talk, people of color can talk with each other to survive, to build each other up. How are we doing that? And then where we can have those interracial dialogues, and really, how are you building those authentic relationships with others? And again, that trust has to be built, and it takes time. And so just recognizing our biases, we all have them. Recognizing and checking those when we're engaging. I think that's part of it. There's a lot, but it's 5:59. I want to make sure we honor the time. So did you have any last words or that you want to leave everyone with?
No, I'm glad everybody came. We'll do another one, recommend a book study. I think that's good. I think Tasha and I will do another one of these, because as we're talking, and I'll make sure you all get it. just some concepts. And you all know how to get a hold of us. If there's some things you think we should cover, send them to us. But thank you. Love all y'all. Thank you for being here. We really do appreciate the support.
Yes, thank you. And I love book studies. So yes, if you want to do that, just inbox me because I'm in for it. So have a great evening, everyone. And thank you.